I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds and welcome to my horror house. Last night the BBC aired the third and final episode of their fancy pants new adaptation of Dracula, and I believe that the episode's become available on Netflix today. Episode 3 was called The Dark Compass, and if anyone can explain to me why it was called that, I must have missed that. I'd be very grateful for it. In a series that it's fair to say has divided people into love or loathe, the third episode is appropriately enough very divisive, and an awful lot of people seem to like it and an awful lot of people seem to really hate it. As with a lot of stuff that is written by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, while I was watching it I was really enthusiastic about it. I liked it. With some time passing and it bedding down in my memory a bit, I like it with reservations. An awful lot of their stuff, especially with Sherlock as well, can be a bit flashy, and if you want to start picking at it later, some of it loses its luster. But all in all, was it a worthwhile endeavour to adapt Dracula again over 3 90-minute episodes? What was the story they were trying to tell? Yes, I think it was worth it. I can see why it's annoyed purists. I don't really care that it annoys purists. You have Stoker's novel and you have a gazillion films and TV versions of Dracula, none of which really stick to the book, apart from perhaps quite closely the 1977 BBC adaptation. Do you want the same adaptation over and over and over again? Because I certainly don't. And let's be honest, Stoker's novel, which I love, is not completely cinematic. It's a work of prose, so you won't be surprised that everyone plunders Jonathan Harker going to Castle Dracula, phenomenally atmospheric and cinematic. A lot of people plunder The Voyage of the Demeter, brilliant. An awful lot of people plunder Dracula's feeding on and turning of Lucy, and Lucy becoming a vampire, and after that the book becomes a lot more prosaic and a lot less filmable for TV and film. What we really need to look at is, did this final episode cap off this version of Dracula, and was it a worthwhile story to tell? And yes, kinda is how I would bullet point it. Let's talk about the time jump to modern day. We jump forward 123 years and why I don't think that matters. Luckily, I think there was a reason for it beyond just to have a hashtag WTF moment at the end of episode 2. And I would take this back to Stoker's novel. Bram Stoker intended for Dracula to travel to a modern, technological metropolis full of dictaphone machines and science and blood transfusions. The reader of his original novel was supposed to see Dracula in amongst the modern, bang up to date metropolis and people that they would recognise when they go outside of their front door. So I'm not necessarily bothered when Dracula comes up to the modern day. If you keep everything in period, we see everything in period, and we see Dracula wandering around Victorian England. That's fantastic. I've got no issue with that. Visually, that's lush and gorgeous and done correctly. Looks perfectly splendid. Stoker's intention was to place Dracula in amongst us now. I said as much when I reviewed a while back Dracula AD 1972. As hokey as that is, Dracula is supposed to be transplanted into a bustling, vibrant metropolis. And he is here. The scenes with the kids in the nightclub and out and about in London at night, I honestly thought this is what AD 1972 could have been if the kids had sounded like kids and acted like kids, and then Dracula could have come in and fucked them up. I'll hold my hand up though and admit that putting Dracula into the 21st century in this does allow the writers to lean back on some visual flourishes and stuff, well-worn stuff that they have had going on in Sherlock. You know, Dracula using Tinder, the floaty text messages, the Instagram selfie generation and the like. But what it also does is it shows that Dracula is timeless. It shows us, rather than have him tell us, that he does live from century to century and adapts and moves on. And this is the life he lives. I loved the scenes of Dracula getting used to being in the modern age and then having things about the 21st century that he loves and things that he really doesn't like about it. It's also good to see this character at a disadvantage while he's trying to find his feet in the 21st century, especially in the first act. We jump forward again 3 months and he's, in that very, very short period, he's established himself again. Ultimately, in the final analysis, after all 3 episodes have aired, I feel that what the intention in this adaptation is clearly not to faithfully adapt Bram Stoker's novel from the page straight onto the screen, but to use that as a source and a framework with which to really write a love letter of sorts to Dracula throughout history and all his regenerations and all his changes through television, stage and cinema. And the references again come thick and fast here. And I've not found any of these references to be obnoxious in any way, which is quite a difficult balancing act to pull off. We had a little Shining moment in episode 1, and again, Dr. Seward's wallpaper in his digs is the same pattern as the carpet of the Overlook Hotel in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I've mentioned earlier that the kids out and about in the London nightclub instantly made me think of Dracula, AD 1972 from Hammer, and they must have had it in mind because the oncology ward that Zoe Van Helsing is on is ward AD 072. When Dracula comes to the club to hook up with Lucy for the first time, was it only me that was thinking of Jerry Dandridge in his sexy sweater in Fright Night? There's a lovely moment where Renfield places his hand on Dracula's shoulder and Dracula wordlessly looks at him and he removes it, which is a direct nod to a moment between Renfield and Dracula in Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. Some people, myself included, were wondering whether Dracula trapped in his coffin underwater was a reference to something that happens to Angel in the Angel TV series, and now that episode 3 has a vampire getting staked and then burning up to ash in the same way that the vampires die in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you've got to think that there's a strong possibility that that's a knowing thing that they did. And of course, most blatant of all, Zoe Van Helsing running down the table, jumping at the curtains to pull them down in exactly the same way that Van Helsing bests Dracula at the end of Hammer's 1958 Dracula movie. But all of these nods and winks wouldn't be worth a jot if there wasn't a story to tell. In my video for episode 2, I said that what I wanted and what they needed in order to fulfill the writer's contract that they flag up at the start of that episode is to discuss Dracula's efforts to procreate and to resolve Sister Agatha Van Helsing's suspicion that all of Dracula's limitations, fear of the cross, inability to enter a place unless invited, and that sunlight is deadly to him, all those fears are one fear, and if we can find the source of Dracula's fear, we can understand what limits him. These are resolved to a greater or lesser extent, and I didn't find them entirely satisfying. I'm still not 100% sure what Dracula's tinkering with his brides and trying to create the perfect brides is necessarily all about. I don't feel bereft that wasn't spelled out to me. I'm not particularly bothered about that because the real resolution, Dracula's limitations, we are given a definitive answer to it. Now, I wasn't sure that that was going to happen, and I honestly thought for the longest time in this 90-minute run that they were teasing us along to a sort of be-continued cliffhanger to get another series greenlit. I mean, 25 minutes to go, and I was thinking, this is going to end really soon, and they really haven't addressed this at all, and they do take it right down to the wire. The downside to that is that there's not really a sense of urgency in this episode that an epic story is being brought to its resolution. The urgency was coming more towards me looking at my watch and thinking, there's not much more of this to go, and I really want you to wrap this up rather than to leave me dangling and frustrated. And up until that final reveal, there's stuff I really liked and stuff I didn't like. I really didn't dig the Renfield character that much, I'll be honest. And the idea of Dracula just hiring a lawyer to get him out of the Jonathan Harker Institute feels more like a plot contrivance now than a cool moment that it kind of seemed like while I was viewing it. All of Dracula's conversations with Lucy, however, especially in the graveyard, was really my jam. I loved all of that kind of stuff. We were allowed in this final episode in more to Dracula's interior world, and I said in episode 2 I really wanted episode 3 to balance out the quippy, jokey Dracula, so that over the course of all 3 we get a much more rounded character, and I really do feel that we got that here. Dracula is more considered, I think, in episode 3. He's more self-regarding. We learn more about his interior process, and by the very, very end, when he's completely undone, I think we do learn that the jokey, quippy, fun-time Count Dracula is all a front and a bravado to the kernel of fear that's inside him. The explanation of his limitations, I'm not 100% sold on that, but it is what it is. I think it's quite telling. I mentioned in my video for episode 2 that the only other adaptation that I can bring to mind that really tried to do something quite radical with why is Dracula afraid of sunlight, why is he this, why is he that, bizarrely is Dracula 2000, which, spoilers for Dracula 2000, reveals that Dracula is in fact Judas. So of course the cross repels him because it's his ultimate betrayal. Silver hurts him because that's how he was paid. Sunlight hurts him because he hung himself, I think at sunrise or sunset, I can't remember. For a film that's so drab and as deep as a puddle, it really does have quite a radical reworking of the Dracula myth and an explanation as to why all of these legends should be as they are. And I actually think it's got a bit more gusto than what we finally come up with in this adaptation of Dracula, which is ultimately that his limitations are all in his head. I was initially very bummed that we weren't getting the return of Sister Agatha, and this was a descendant of hers, Zoe Van Helsing. And then I loved how they actually did bring her back and they became sort of an amalgam. The final confrontation again was with Sister Agatha, or the memories and the will of Sister Agatha against Dracula over the centuries. And I kind of love how it played off at the end, slightly more poetically, slightly more romantically, slightly more conceptually than just we have to fight and kill Dracula. I know that bummed an awful lot of people out, but I've seen Van Helsing stake Dracula a ton of times. I kind of don't need to see it again. Would Dracula really, after all this time, just give up? I don't think he did give up. What I actually think happened is that after all this time, he actually finally met someone who was an opposite to him. But in Agatha Van Helsing, someone who really even just reached beyond death and across time, and was someone that I think he finally felt that he didn't die alone, basically. And here is someone who is dying, who contains also the spirit of this, my antagonist over the centuries. And she's not going to die alone. And if I'm going to go, there's no one else for me to go with than her. So did it end with a bang? No, but was the destination worth it? Ultimately, I do think it was. Do I want to see it return? No. You've told your story, you've done your adaptation, leave it. A Dracula season 2 would be, what, him resurrected and solving crimes. I don't want to see it. I do think each generation benefits from its own Dracula, or maybe skip a generation or two. We've not had anything really big and bold since the Francis Coppola movie in the 90s, so I think the time was ripe, and I actually perversely take a little bit of satisfaction from the fact that it was so out there in places that it just pissed an awful lot of people off. If you don't like the changes made, there's a book I can recommend for you. It's called Dracula, and Bram Stoker wrote it, and I can guarantee you that it's 100% accurate to Bram Stoker's novel Dracula.